Welcome to the online course Visual Theology. We begin where Christian art began, from Judaism. In Judaism, anthropological images were forbidden. In Exodus 20, verses 4 and 5, we read, "You shall not make for yourself an idol or likeness of anything in the heavens above, or on the earth below, or in the waters beneath the earth. You shall not bow down before them or serve them." In other words, nothing in the created natural world was to be represented or worshipped as God. However, we will begin our course with images from a synagogue, even from several of them. Scholars of our days know about some Palestine synagogues, which in the 3rd century of our era were decorated with mosaic pavements. How is this possible? The easiest explanation I found sounds like this. There is no temptation of adoring images if you just walk on them. Besides, the floor mosaics of these 3rd century synagogues mainly present signs of zodiac and decorative motifs, so we will not study them. If you want to learn more, check the links at the end of the lecture. You'll find a lot. Well, we finally begin. We begin with a little synagogue with monumental decoration in Dura-Europos, a teeny tiny little city in modern Syria. Dura-Europos synagogue is special because it has paintings on both walls and ceiling, a totally unique exception. Bad for the people of the time, but good for us. This synagogue was buried under sand when in 244 of our era the Roman army decided to enhance the city fortification. Soon after that, the Sasanians took the city and deported everybody away from this city to different lands. Since that time, Dura-Europos was abandoned, and it was only occasionally rediscovered in 1920s by British soldiers, digging trenches near Euphrates River. The French-American excavations started in 1928, and I'm proud to say that their leader was a man of Russian origin named Michael Rostovtsev. After the revolution, he flew to the United States and worked at Yale. After 10 seasons of excavations, the artifacts were divided between Damascus and Yale, and paintings remained in Damascus. Dura-Europos was a diverse cosmopolitan city and also a fortress, oasis of multicultural society. We can say it because archaeologists found over 100 parchments and papyrus fragments. The texts were in Greek, Latin, Palmyrean, Hebrew, and several other languages. Maybe this is the reason why the Jewish community at Dura-Europos was exceptionally liberal in the attitude toward the ban against the images. From the point of view of style, Dura-Europos paintings and sculptures are not really unique. Geographically, it was one of the closest neighbors of Palmyra, another city on the territory of modern Syria. Some centuries before Dura-Europos, Palmyra already had its rich and quite distinct culture, going back to 2nd millennium before Christ. It began as a stopover for people traveling from the east to the west and back, and quickly grew into a wealthy trade hub. Commercial prosperity came hand in hand with visual culture. Now, Palmyra is famous for its funeral booths and other artifacts in museums all over the world. The architectural context and subjects. Frescoes in Dura-Europos synagogue were painted in 244 of our era. It's the earliest example of wall paintings depicting common biblical scenes of both Old and New Testament: Pharaoh's daughter finding infant Moses, David and Goliath, Moses providing water to the tribes, story of the destruction of the temple, and others. After almost 100 years of studies, it's still uncertain if the cycle of murals had an overall program, which would explain their order and positions. These images have no interaction with architecture, except for the special niche for Torah with its own individual decoration. All the other scenes are evenly distributed on the walls in 3 levels, with no accent or specific role appointed to any of them. We don't know their purpose and meaning, and yet we can understand a lot just by observing the images. What do they tell us? First and foremost, let's try to evaluate the work of art from its author's perspective. It's a synagogue where images should be banned. However, the rabbi or somebody else decided to order these murals. Why would he do that? What was he thinking? What restrictions did he apply upon the artist's freedom? I will suppose that if your religion doesn't allow you to worship an image, you will avoid creating a situation in which it will become possible. Therefore, even painting anthropomorphic figures, you will present them with no particular beauty, not to provoke any kind of veneration or adoration. Then, how will you present them? Will you try to create some portrait-like images to capture a personal appearance of people you depict? No, because it would be too tempting. Keeping this in mind, you will only present Christ, Moses, and others as historical personalities, avoiding any chance one can get affectionate with the image. That's why the artist has chosen this linear way to portray his characters. He wanted us to recognize them as real, so he provided a bit of historical context, and yet we mainly see linear contours, because painting human figures on a wall of a synagogue, artists preferred summarized approach to comply with the Bible requirement. Why should we have to look at them? And how are they relevant to us? Let's continue to analyze the tasks and purposes of Dura-Europos artists. We will see right away that most figures in Dura-Europos were painted in frontal positions. They don't have any depth of space which we used to see in Renaissance and classical artworks. And if we make a little effort, dismissing the idea that these frescoes were painted by a child, if we seriously consider them to be professional pieces, we will discover that they have their own system of values. We can see that instead of trying to make their figures look lifelike, artists use their energy for different things. Accepting that their visual culture could be as developed as ours, we can begin appreciating what they have to offer. Working on their compositions, finding proper color combinations, planning the general layout and design of the building, artists were really starving to solve their problems, not just to decorate the synagogue walls. Let's start from the most special part. As we have mentioned, this artist had no intention to create an optical illusion of space behind the figures. He or she rather invites us to see a story unfolding in front of our eyes. We can compare this with the way people are depicted in ancient texts, like Iliad or Odyssey by Homer. Presenting the figures in frontal position, the artist makes them obey the limited areas of their spaces. This approach is characteristic for many ancient visual cultures, and we can see how virtually artists use it. The size and position of the figure in the seemingly flat visual space is very important. It's the interaction with other figures and elements of the same space which are already becoming a huge part of the story. We often see that flat background in iconography, and we will speak about it later a lot. Now let's just try to look at them with our fresh eyes. For the first glance of a person living in 21st century, these figures may look abstracted. It's true, not always the poses seem really natural, but if we admit that they interact with gestures, we will see that they do deliver the message the artist wanted. And exactly because of the desire to make this message as straightforward as possible, the artist removes the three-dimensionality as unnecessary. I'm afraid to say anything about the colors though. Unfortunately, we can't trust them much. They have changed with time, and due to wrong development of photographs, we only can see some general plan. Looking at the way the images are distributed in the architecture, I think the placement of these images is similar to how they could be painted on a codex page or in a roll of parchment. Abstracted, flat interpretation of figures, no close-up portraits, almost solely events. For me, the closest reference is illustrations. All of them are linear, but that's natural for images from Palmyra culture, where all folds of all garments were normally depicted that way. The artist gives just a brief idea of the event to trigger our imagination, demonstrating no particular interest in making it look picturesque and elaborate. These wall paintings give the earliest and also one of the best examples of what later will be called Biblia Pauperum. Then image is used instead of text instructional display to educate and teach illiterate people. In addition to the synagogue, the excavations also revealed a small Christian chapel. It was a tiny little house church of the same period, middle of the 3rd century. Just a little house adopted by Christian community for use as a meeting place and baptistry. This is the oldest preserved Christian house church known up to date. This little chapel preserves the very first Christian paintings, and we know exactly the year. They were painted in 244. The murals of Christian chapel look even more simplistic than the ones of the synagogue. We see the same approach. They all depict events or actions. Questions and answers. Why Dura-Europos is so important? Because it's the largest cycle of earliest Jewish and Christian biblical imagery produced about the year 240. They remained intact as they were buried under the sand and rediscovered only in 1920s. These flat figures on flat backgrounds allow the artist to solve purely artistic problems, such as composition, color, texture, and others. Their visual message was not made to provoke our admiration or to decorate the building. We can guess that these images were made to trigger our memory to meditate on biblical events, so they only provided essential details of the events, inviting us to be part of them. Part 2. Fayum portraits. One more ancestor of iconography, the Italian explorer Pietro della Valle, was the first European who discovered and described mummy portraits on his visit to Saqqara, Memphis in 1615. Although the portraits are called Fayum portraits after their initial find spot, they have been found throughout Egypt. They represent people of all genders and ages. Now these portraits can be seen in almost every national museum in almost every country. What do we know of them? Not much. We mainly know that they were intended to be both physically and spiritually attached to the body of the deceased. Why did they use them? What role do they play for contemporary iconographers? Let's see a bit of a context. Fayum portraits were created in Egypt when it was under Romans, but we see portraits of dead pharaoh in earlier periods too. Egyptians simply followed ancient traditions. For several centuries before our era, the bodies of members of Egypt elite were mummified, equipped with a decorated coffin and a mummy mask to cover the head. Some authors suggest that the idea of such realistic portraits may be related to the custom among the Roman nobility. They used to have wax masks and bronze or marble busts of their ancestors. In funeral processions, these wax masks were worn by professional mourners to emphasize the continuity of family line. However, originally they could be representing a deeper evocation of the presence of the dead. Roman festivals such as Parentalla, as well as everyday domestic rituals, cultivated ancestral spirits. Therefore, the development of mummy portraiture may represent a combination of traditional Egyptian and New Roman funerary practices, as it appears only after Egypt was established as a Roman province. Since that time, realistic images bit by bit were replacing the more schematic Egyptian masks of earlier types. Even in recent times, a great number of scholars was certain that these stunning lifelike images could only be painted from people who were still alive. Yet, some of them doubted that, as it was hard to believe that children's portraits would have also been produced in advance. It's not easy to imagine ancient Egyptians having their children's portraits always ready for the future funerary. The truth was discovered only some years ago when computer tomography scans revealed a straight correspondence of age between the mummy and its painted image. Actually, artists were only invited to paint the portraits after their subjects would pass away. This can be the reason why most of these portraits have sad face expressions. How they were produced? Most of Fayum portraits were painted on very thin wooden panels, about 5 mm or 1/5 of an inch. Two painting techniques were employed: animal glue tempera and encaustic. These two techniques can partially explain the way these images look and the effects the artist tried to achieve with them. The first one, tempera. It's a painting technique executed with pigment ground on water-soluble medium. The word tempera originally came from the verb tempera, to bring to desired consistency. We know 3 most common animal glues traditionally used for tempera. All of them are still used by artists in our days. They produce 3 main types of organic tempera binders arranged by the method of their production. Method 1. Glue tempera. The glue was usually produced by boiling fish or animal bones or skins, aiming to extract some kind of gelatin at the end. This rigid and strong glue was mostly used for carpentry, to prepare plaster and gesso for binding some objects to the image surface. To use it for painting, artists added oil or other substances to make it softer. The second option was to use egg yolk, egg white or whole egg emulsion as a binder. There can be a whole bunch of slightly different techniques which now go under the umbrella of egg tempera. The third type, also known quite widely, was used both in ancient times and in our days. It's casein, another organic binder extracted from milk products like cottage cheese. Using any of these glues as binder for your paint, you will have tempera, because this term is used towards all solid water-soluble paints. If you are interested in trying or making some contemporary tempera, consider polyvinyl acetate tempera. However, it's too early to talk about their durability. They were invented only a few decades ago. Now we move to the second technique, due to which Fayum portraits have become so famous. It is called encaustic. The word encaustic comes from the Greek enkaustikos, which means to burn in, referring to the process of final fusing colors with heat. In our times, the term encaustic is used for any painting technique with wax involved. After several hundreds of years of experiments and discussions about the most proper original encaustic receipt, most scholars agree that even in ancient times there used to be 2 types of encaustic, hot and cold. In those works, where the wax is used as a primary binder, the technique is called hot encaustic. Hot encaustic suggests use of heated, bleached and purified beeswax, Punic wax, while the cold encaustic is performed with some tempera binder enriched with emulsified wax. Professional artists masterfully applying expressive brushstrokes could easily produce an impressionistic effect, because with encaustic it's easy. Paintings done with tempera are always more subtle. They have finer gradations of tones and chalkier colors. They are more reserved and more abstract. Yet we are here not to learn how to differentiate these two types, but to see that different techniques were taken for different results. To make our picture more complicated, I have to say that some Fayum portraits combine several techniques. Often the artist would start making a drawing with tempera because it allows more precision, and when the drawing was ready, would pass to painting with wax. Sometimes in Fayum portraits we can even encounter use of gold leaf. It was introduced to render jewelry and wreath more real. How did Fayum portraits influence the history of iconography? Even though we know about their existence, we can admire them and study them in museums, it's only because we live in the 21st century. No European artist who lived between the 5th and the 17th centuries ever saw any of them. They were literally buried. Fayum portraits have not been accessible to generations of iconographers, and only in 1615 the first European saw the first Fayum portrait. That's why we have no reason to draw a connection between Fayum portraits and Christian liturgical art. The lack of documentary and material evidences makes any theory of straight evolution of Fayum portraits into icons improbable. Besides, Egyptian burial traditions sharply declined in the 4th century due to the change of the situation in Egypt. What are Fayum portraits for us? Questions and answers. Fayum portraits are, of course, the ancestors of icons. They reveal the context in which the Christian iconography was born. They clearly demonstrate a wide range of painterly expertise and stunning skills in painting. These artists were willing to create great lifelike portraits, and they succeeded. The graded flesh tones are enhanced with shadows and highlights, indicative of directional lighting. All this testifies the highest artistic professionalism and education of their authors. For iconographers, Fayum portraits can serve as proof of artistic professionalism in ancient times. They can be a great source of inspiration. They also can be an example of how the artistic preferences shaped the final result. So, is it okay to paint icons in realistic Fayum portrait style? I have heard this question several times, and I think it's just impossible. Artists who created these Fayum portraits had different purposes from those of iconographers. Artists of Fayum portraits, first of all, aimed to create portraits. While painting an icon, we mainly seek to produce an image for prayer, not for nostalgic memories. How then can we define the specific goals of iconographers, and what makes them different from Fayum portraits? What are the aspects of artistic work an iconographer needs to excel? To answer these questions, we need to see and know more of early Christian art. So we will discuss these questions in our next lectures. To know more about Palmyra, Dura-Europos and Fayum portraits, check the links in the description below.